Ready. Cover your ears.
How about these? At number one, fire! Fire! Fire!
That's the sound of the artillery during the American Civil War.
He had men out here from the 8th and 11th Alabama deployed as skirmishers to the front, and he had his main body back along behind those trees in the valley. And he also had the 10th Alabama back actually in the valley just past Pitzer's Wood, protecting the far right of his line. Now, as the skirmishers were out here, they were sort of advancing, trying to figure out what's going on with the Federals, and the Federals are advancing toward them as well. And eventually, once you catch sight of each other as a force, the obvious thing is going to happen. You're going to get a meeting engagement. Lying down and using the weapon. Doing this with a muzzle-loading rifle musket is a rather tricky proposition. The guys from Verdun, breech loaders, could easily load and fire lying down. As these forces sort of felt along and were trying to gauge the strength of each other, Verdun's could keep up a more rapid and a more accurate fire on the Southern skirmishers. But the Southern skirmishers tried to hold and buy time, trying to figure out what to do, as Wilcox was deploying his forces to better receive what was an attack that, again, he did not have a full understanding of what the strength was. Better technology, and in fact with better numbers, would get so far and realize they were in a position where they needed to halt, see what they could gauge and figure out about the enemy, and understanding that they were in a position that was not particularly good, would begin falling back. And in fact, the Verdun's people pushed them rather quickly, and some of the units fell back more precipitously than others. In fact, the amount of fire that Verdun's could keep up even caused some of the main line here to the far Confederate left, basically to my right, to fall back. But you'll remember I mentioned Alabama, which had begun to move into the woods behind you. And as the Confederate troops were basically falling back in this area along this open field, battlefield down well. The Verdun sharpshooters, even though they're fighting in open order, which is a much more secure and a much better position, the 10th Alabama advanced through the woods behind you and began basically doing what's called change direction to the left, basically a big left wheel so that they could bring around their forces. And what this would do would actually present, even to soldiers in open order, people being exposed on the flank. And anytime your flank is exposed and you can be hit with a great deal of fire, this changes your perception on how things work, to put it mildly. As the 10th peeled out of the woods, they realized they were clearly on the flank of some of the initial elements of Verdun. They unleashed a mass fire with the entire battalion, or the entire regiment. Understand, this is only 2 companies. The 10th Alabama would have had 10, so about 5 times that many men firing down the flank of Verdun and also some of the elements of the 3rd Maine. At this point, these troops realized they were too far forward. They were not supported to fall back. Now you'll notice with a volley fire, one of the things is everybody on your line is unloaded simultaneously. It's going to take 20 or 30 seconds before you're unloaded and ready to go. And in fact, most of the times when troops were engaged, they would do what's called fire by file, which would start at the right end of each company, and the men would continue to load and fire until given the command to cease fire. This way you could keep up a continuous rolling fire on your line. As this action continued, additional elements of Wilcox's brigade was brought up, and Verdun's and the 3rd Maine began to withdraw back the way they had come, but some members of Verdun's, realizing how horribly exposed they were, began running for the cover of the houses up near and along the Peach Orchard and along the Gettysburg Road. The Alabamans pursued and kept up enough fire on them that they said, it's time to fall back. We sort of figured out, at least we think we figured out what we've seen, and they fell back to their positions back beyond the Peach Orchard.
Load and shoulder.
The commanding officers given the command to cease fire, at which point the soldiers would load their weapons, shoulder them, indicating that their weapon is loaded, and then be prepared for the next command of execution, whether it would be another fire command or whether it would be a command of movement. What the men are going to demonstrate again is another of the massed volley, and again, this is just 2 companies. Imagine a whole regiment with 10 times this many men firing at once, and several times on this battlefield. Again, you have short sight distances, and you have trees, and sometimes you come upon the enemy and you can deliver a crushing blow with a big single volley. On the 1st of July on McPherson's Ridge is the 2nd Wisconsin. The 1st unit of the Iron Brigade to become engaged, as they descended the slope of that ridge, they came into the 7th and the 14th Tennessee, which unleashed a single large volley with both regiments into the 2nd Wisconsin, causing over 20% casualties with a single volley. The men are now going to clear their weapons to ensure that they're safe to operate. Now, again, infantry combat, again, that your command and control is easier with this formation. May not look like it's incredibly effective, and in certain times it is quite dangerous, but it's also the easiest way to maintain the control of your troops and try to get your block of fire concentrated against the enemy, because that's the goal, is to cause basically as much damage as quickly as you can against the enemy. Now, the infantryman, in addition to his rifle musket, or in some cases some of these troops even have the short rifle, what's the other weapon an infantryman carries? The bayonet. Those of you who've done a lot of reading on Civil War stuff have probably read about bayonet charges and bayonet assaults and bayonet attacks and bayonet fighting. Part of the problem is that bayonet is more a weapon of psychological shock than physical shock. If you look at the casualty records of the Army of the Potomac and you remove the cavalry casualties, less than 1% of all wounds were caused by edged weapons. Because when you're dealing with a bayonet attack, it's not some wild screaming charge. It is a steady advance where you believe you've caused enough damage to the enemy infantry that you can assault and break them at push of steel. And if you're on the receiving end of a bayonet attack and you see forces advancing, you're shooting, you're causing casualties, your artillery's blowing holes in them, and they still keep closing ranks and advancing on you, particularly if you're caught in the open, for the average soldier, somewhere in the back of his brain, something starts going off that I'm really in the wrong place. And if enough of the men begin thinking that way, your unit will break. And in some cases, the best thing you can actually do if you're the commander in that situation is to launch a countercharge if you can, because it's better to take a bayonet attack moving than standing still. But interestingly enough, where you see many of the cases where people do bayonet fighting, it's in cases where people have substantial works in front of them, like breastworks at Spotsylvania. But even on places such on this battlefield where you have infantry on the Union side deployed behind the low stone walls on Cemetery Ridge, it's not really much of a physical barrier, but it's enough of a psychological barrier that men will stand and fight and go at it with bayonets and gun butts. This essentially concludes my presentation on infantry tactics and what went on here on the 2nd of July, just about this time, 150 years ago today.